this is a quintessential, I guess, zero slash negative sum game.
Correct.
Right? Like you have your bets, you have a vig, you have a cost of betting, and there are winners and losers on both sides of this that are, I'm assuming, in almost perfect balance. Is that correct assumption, or is there a market maker, so to speak? Is the bookmaker actually taking action and hosting that on their books, as maybe back in the day a trader would, right? So the trader's trying to balance the books and will hold an inventory. How does that work in the betting world?
Yeah, there's no question that the betting world is 100 times bigger, of course, the market size, but I would say the sophistication is also decades ahead. So it's a good analogy you make about the old days where the commodity traders or the local, and I mentioned Chicago in the 30s and 40s where a lot of the point spread originated. Keep in mind, back in the 20s and 30s, they had the stockbroker shops. Some of them were illegal and underground, just like bookmaking shops. So yeah. I do, and now, we've come to a point, we'll talk later in the show about the history and the future of sports betting, but we've come to a real crossroads in the U.S. now the last 2 years where states can finally legalize sports betting. So until the last 2 years, Nevada's been the only state for the last 50 years in the U.S. that had legal sports betting. So unless you're in the state of Nevada, you technically were betting with an underground illegal local bookie, or until the last 20 years with a website in Costa Rica or Antigua. So it really has been the wild, wild west. And Rodrigo knows this with poker. We've seen that go full circle the last 10, 15 years with the regulation and stuff in the mid-2000s. But yeah, the similarities are there, but there's also a lot of differences. And that, of course, is one of them. But the other one is it's definitely not a zero-sum game when you really break it down. Like commodities, stock market, it's zero-sum. There's a buyer and a seller. There's a winner and loser on every trade. Once again, the point spread's an opinion. And if the bookmakers get it right or they get it wrong, can make a big difference. If they get the number wrong, the professional sharp bettors like myself are going to hammer it. And keep in mind, theoretically, you want to get balanced action because you're risking 11 to win 10, which means if they get balanced action on both sides, they're taking that 10% commission. That breaks out, by the way, to 4.5% house edge. And for the quants out there, I'll break that down real quick. The reason it's not a 10% house edge is because you're risking 110 to win 100. So if they team A and team B gets $100 bets from each bettor, the sportsbook is taking in $220. When one of those wins, they have to give back $210. The 110 investment plus the 100 winning. So they're netting $10 on $220 handle. So that comes out to 4.5%. So that's why they don't have a 10% edge, even though your VIG is 10%. So the house edge is very small, 4.5%. Rodrigo, as you know, blackjack's 1%. If you card count, it's almost zero. Craps with optimals play is less than 1%. So on the surface, that sounds good, 4.5%. But then you take slot machines, which are an automatic 10, 20% quantitative systematic handle, because they're programmed. So sportsbooks have a lot of risk. And then again, it's not balanced action. The Super Bowl Sunday is more than they might take in on all sports that month. So they have a bad Sunday on the Super Bowl. They could have a lose in February, despite all the other months of the year. So it's definitely not zero sum.
There's not a lot of liquidity, right? There's not as much liquidity as there is in the market. So you don't have the law of large numbers there. There's a lot more. The VIG has to be higher, and also I imagine the variance is quite high as well for these guys.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed though,
just especially
and one thing I've noticed too is over the last 24 years I've been doing this, the point spread has definitely become more accurate. You can always say, is it efficient or is it accurate? It's accurate because so many games land within a point or two of the number, and that's what's fascinating to. People look and be like, wow, that college basketball game had 150 points scored and it was within 1 point of the over-under. I was like, well, what about the NBA? The NBA has 220 some points on average scored, and their totals, every point you get is worth like anywhere from 2 to 4% in edge. So if you could just get an extra point on every NBA play, side or total, you'd automatically win without even having a handicap. That's how accurate the numbers are. But they hardly ever get balanced action. So almost every game, every night, the sports books have a liability on one side or the other. And like Rodrigo said, that's why they're charging a 10% commission, because they have to make up for that inaccuracy overall.
So my wife constantly points that out to me on when we do our annual, like our football picks, you get to pick for the week, or you're doing survival pools and whatnot. She always points out, look at all these games. They're the half point determines a third of the games every week. It's ridiculous that the half point actually comes into play.
Well, something to keep in mind about football, because this is a great example. Football, unlike any other sport, has key numbers because of the way scoring occurs. Now, basketball, it's all 2s, 3-pointers. There's no key number. You can make a slight statistical argument from research that the number 7 in basketball, obviously football, but in basketball, 7, some people feels is a slightly key number because it makes a difference when teams start fouling or not with a couple minutes to go to try to stay in contention. So a slightly more statistical amount of games do land on 7 in the NBA and college hoops maybe than other numbers, but not enough where it really matters. But now football, obviously, it's all 3-pointers and 7-pointers, touchdowns and field goals. So 3-point games are very common. 7-point games are very common. And, Mike, with your football background, CFL is a little different, of course, because they have the 1-point rouge and they have, different extra point. And it has switched a little bit in the NFL, by the way, because teams go for 2 more now. But the other side of that is that a dead number like 5 happens more now in the NFL because teams might go for 2 instead of just kicking that field goal and making 6 or 7. But then again, they get to the key numbers more often because they can go for 2. So there's 2 ways to look at it. But long term, about 10% of the time in the NFL, a 3-point a favorite is going to win by 3 points. 10% of the time. So that means 1 out of every 10 games, a favorite's going to win by exactly 3 points. And about 5% of the time, they win by exactly 7 points. So if you have a 6.5 or 7-point favorite, a 2.5 or 3-point favorite, there's a 10 to 15% chance those games are going to land on the number. And when you have 15 NFL games on a Sunday, and you have maybe 3 or 4 of them that have a 3-point spread because it's such a key number, odds makers are hesitant to move on and off of it. There's a good chance every week that a team's going to win by 3 as a 3-point favorite. So it looks amazing in hindsight, but then when you really start crunching the numbers, you realize how likely it is.
Yeah, that's great. Well, again, this comes into the greater concept in my mind is literally probabilistic thinking. So the outcomes, I think in markets, because it's a bit of a continuous game, it's sort of harder for people to visualize the actual, okay, here's an outcome. We ended, the event ended and we have this endpoint to look at. Well, the markets become this continuous game. So where's your endpoint? How does that evolve? Slightly different, but very similar in the stance of, you've got probabilities on outcomes and you have imperfect information and you have to make judgments within that imperfect information. And so the process with which you go through making those decisions is incredibly important. And I think, that is some of that is some of the skill that you're bringing to the table in the sports betting world. And with 24-year history of actually being able to be proven and profitable in that domain, to me, it almost defies believability for me. I'm always extremely impressed where, you've got this kind of ability to just demonstrate outperformance on a regular basis over a time frame that is absolutely meaningful. Like, this is skill. This isn't luck.
Especially with a VIG.
Probably don't want to tell them. Right? Yeah. You don't want to tell the tax guys that, because is it taxable in the US, or how does it work?
Yeah, they're well aware of all that.
Oh, are they?
Yeah.
Damn. I mean, it's just chance. It's just chance. It's not income.
Well, and to be honest, that's the reason why I knew eventually we would have legalized sports betting in all these states. It's too big of a market. It's not nearly as big as the financial market, but we've been making Costa Rica and Antigua and these third world countries very rich the last 20 years. And San Jose, Costa Rica is not only a big hub for the internet sports books, it's a big technology hub. IBM, other companies are down there. And a lot of that is because in the late 90s, the sportsbook industry started to boom. So it's a huge market. DraftKings just became publicly traded a few months ago. I've followed that stock closely. It's ripped. People have asked me left and right, what do you think? What do you think? I go, look, I can't value the company. They've been private. I don't have any clue. I don't have any numbers to work with. And now with the COVID shutdown, sports have been out of, rotation for 3 months. There's just no way to value them. And I think they are a big player in the industry, but there's some big boys from England coming over. These sports books have been in England for 80, 90 years. William Hill, 888 Sport. There's some big ones that are in New Jersey already with DraftKings and FanDuel, and MGM's coming in. I'll tell you the one I think is brilliant is Fox Sports. They've started something called Fox Bet about a year ago, all free, just acquiring users. And of course, these companies already have millions of users just from being in the sports world. So yeah, they just have been licking at the chop for this stuff to open up. But yeah, the tax revenue is the reason it's happening. Once again, it's like the government finally realized it's everywhere. We're not stopping it. We might as well get our cut of it.
Regulate and tax.
So,
Yeah,
can you chat a little bit about the those markets that you mentioned? You know, Vegas, the offshore sports book, the new U.S. sports books coming in, given the Supreme Court decision. Like, how do they vary in like Costa Rica? Like, I had no clue. I don't do sports betting, so that was kind of interesting to me. And I think you also had an interesting story about the recent COVID crisis and that Costa Rica. There was a bit of an opportunity there as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, just going back to the history of the point spread again, you know, as I mentioned, for the last 50 years, Vegas was the only legal game in the U.S. And you always hear the Las Vegas, the point spread, this and that. And until the 90s, until these offshore sportsbook call centers originated, that was the only place to bet other than an illegal bookie. So Las Vegas always set the number. In fact, to be technical, the Stardust Hotel, up until the mid-90s, the Stardust was the originator of the opening line. They were the biggest and baddest sportsbook out there. I was actually in Las Vegas in the early 2000s when they blew it up at 6 a.m. So it was a bittersweet moment because I'd gone there in the 90s quite often. That was the mecca of sports betting. The Las Vegas Hilton, which is now the Westgate, they have a huge superbook. Art Monteras started that in the 90s. That was kind of the other big sports book out there. And they had the Hilton Super Contest still, which is the NFL contest where you enter $1,500 and you pick 5 NFL games every Sunday. The winner gets the pot. Back in the 90s, that was maybe a couple hundred people, very prestigious, all professionals like myself. You know, Rodrigo, you'll appreciate this analogy. It's basically become like the World Series of Poker now. You have several thousand people entering it. They have a proxy service where you can sign up in person, then have someone put the picks in for you when you're out of state. So the internet has obviously made that easier for people to find out about it. And I have actually stopped playing the Super Contest a couple years ago. Just due to the fact it was a crapshoot. It was a lottery ticket. It just wasn't.
Yeah, the numbers have gone way up, and you can't play more of it, right? Like if you could play that every single day for 365 days a year, you would still have an edge. But the fact that it's once a year and it's 10x what it used to be, the chances of you getting paid out on that it's just in your lifetime you may get really unlucky.
Right.
So, yeah, that's always an issue with all this stuff.
It's the same thing with the World Series of Poker. You know, when the TV boom happened in 2002, really Chris Moneymaker, 2003, I believe, that changed everything. Now, for someone that's a professional poker player, Rodrigo, it was actually great because you had so many squares, a term we haven't talked about yet. But the squares that were rushing into the online poker room were easy pickings. And I fiddled with it a little bit for that reason. It's just so time consuming. You know, I looked into card counting in the early 90s before I became a sports professional and learned to card count, learned the odds on that. And then I just quickly realized what a long, tedious grind that is. And I just couldn't get in for poker for that same reason. But yeah, there was opportunities there. And I'll bring that full circle to what we're talking about now with the sports betting markets becoming legal in New Jersey, 10, 15 other states the last 2 years. My home state, Virginia, just legalized it. It's supposed to go into law actually this Wednesday, July 1st. It'll be signed into law. I'm licking my chops here like poker 15 years ago because I think it's bringing in a lot of amateur square money. The problem is you have to be in your actual state to bet. So I can't take advantage right now of a line in New Jersey being off versus Virginia. Although I have a feeling the big boys are going to probably universalize their lines. They're going to be in all 20 states and they'll just have one set line. They'll be able to pool all their money together. And that's one of the reasons the big sports books for England are coming in, because when you get big enough, you know, as Mike mentioned earlier, if you could eventually get enough action and handle, and Rodrigo, you were talking about this, then the averages start to work for you and you don't get as lopsided on one game because you have so many bets, so many bettors coming in. You can really start getting close to that 50-50 action. You can really start being a true bookmaker and moving the lines based on action and balancing your book with that 10% vig on each side. But yeah, in the early to mid 90s, the Stardust set the line. All the local bookies would just copy and follow it. In the late 90s, these offshore books came about. By the mid 2000s, the offshore books basically were the leaders in the industry. Vegas was the followers, and it's been that way ever since. We'll see what happens here with the U.S. books now becoming legal. From what I've seen so far, they're very public and square, meaning the lines are very soft. They're not getting a lot of sharp action. And once again, the reason is because everybody is set up in Las Vegas. They've been out there for the last 50 years because that was the only game in town. I don't think the sharp bettors are in South Dakota, North New Jersey yet. You know, they haven't located here or put shops yet. I think that's something we're going to see very soon. Something that's on my radar. And
nice.
Well, just to clear up the audience for those listeners, if you haven't already figured it out, the squares are the fish. Maybe nobody knows what
recreational.
Unsophisticated
is professional, right?
Unsophisticated versus.
Yeah, you also hear the term wise guy. that's a term you don't hear as much as when I first started in the 90s and 2000s, but it was always the wise guys were the sharp professional bettors who were respected by the sports books who won long term. So wise guys, sharps, professional, all the same thing. Squares, recreational, public would be the weekend warriors, the guys who are just betting for fun.
Of course.
That
Hey,
do not have an edge.
I'm betting the Eagles this week. I don't care what the line is.
And nothing
Right?
wrong with that. That's the other thing to point out. It is a form of entertainment. We talk about the stock market. A lot of these sports bettors are into day trading now because they have nothing else to do. But there's really, and that's another reason I've been such a proponent of legalized sports betting. Win or lose, if you put down a $20 bet, you get 3 hours of enjoyment out of watching the Eagles play. And then you have a 50-50 shot of actually doubling your money, or you're out to $20. You'd pay $20 to go to a movie for 2 hours. So it's a great form of entertainment.
There's an externality there's a positive externality for squares that sharps don't care about necessarily, right?
Good point.
And it's you're having a good time. Like we don't hang around with my buddies without betting anymore because we just don't have time to follow our teams like we used to. And therefore, it's just you don't know enough. If you want to make it interesting, everybody puts a bet down. You have something to root for. It's a utility outside of that, and it's creating liquidity in a market that's going to get bigger and bigger, especially now with technology, right? Like there's a Canadian company that happens to have a fantastic app for just following sports. Like there's an opportunity there to be able to bet through the app once it becomes legal. And now I can guarantee you, once that's on and live, every one of my every sport game I watch, I'll be betting on.
Sports game. Fun. I love that. So there's a famous Canadian guy who started Bodog Sports, and and we had a brief discussion about that. I wonder if you could. I found it surprising. There's a couple of things. The sharp money and sometimes the limits that you receive. So, for example, if you're a card counter in Vegas, that they can ask you to leave, right? Which is sort of disheartening. That in Vegas, unless you're a loser, you're not welcome, right? The whole point of that is that the externality better be that you enjoy the point of gambling, the free drinks, and you actually have to be a loser because it's within their right if you're card counting to say you can't be here. So if you can win, you're not allowed to partake.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Jersey didn't have quite the same sort of law in place.
Correct.
But I think maybe you can share some points on how you get forced out of some of the dumb books or some of the square books. I think that was a fascinating story.
Yeah, and New Jersey, Atlantic City is always fascinating to me in general. It's in the late 1970s, so it was a little bit before my time when I was a youngin'. But then as I started to learn to card count and pursue this as a 16, 17, 18-year-old, waiting to become legally able to enter the casinos, I was ready to go when I turned 21. Might have made an appearance or two before then, but we won't talk about that on the show. Being in Virginia, obviously Atlantic City was very close, but in the late 70s, when Atlantic City started, everyone said that was going to be the death of Las Vegas. And, in hindsight, obviously it's comical. In fact, the whole reason we have legalized sports betting in other states in Nevada right now is because Atlantic City was not successful. And it's funny how everything comes full circle, but they did not elect to legalize sports betting. And up until 1992, when this federal law was passed banning all sports betting in other states, they still had a chance to be grandfathered in. They declined to do it in 1992. One of the reasons was Bill Bradley, former NBA player, was the state senator from New Jersey at the time that pushed the bill through Congress in 92. So when they've started to struggle year after year, Trump struggled with his properties there. Even he couldn't make money. There's been what Atlantic City got wrong was that it wasn't a destination spot like Vegas. Vegas relies so heavily on the international crowd, the Asian crowd. And it's just something about Atlantic City was never the same. You go one block from Atlantic City, it was very dangerous. It wasn't a good atmosphere. It wasn't safe. So they can never overcome that. So they've been struggling recently. Chris Christie, the governor for many years, wanted sports betting, but he couldn't get past his federal blockage. And he lost about 5 appeals. It finally got up to the Supreme Court. In December of 16, they heard it, or December of 17, they heard it. And of May of 18, just over 2 years ago, they ruled in favor of allowing states to legalize it. So New Jersey was ready to go within a month. They had sports betting in the summer of 18. So basically, the reason we're going to have it in every state the next 5 to 10 years in the U.S. is because Atlantic City was not successful. And it's an interesting thing because if you look at the sports betting markets versus the financial markets, that's another thing we talked about earlier. There's a winner and loser, in every trade in the financial markets. You don't always have that in the sports betting markets. And it's going to be interesting to see with all this new public money coming in. By the way, Rodrigo, Score is the Canadian company. I used to do a lot of TV for them when they had the net with the TV network up there, and I've met a lot of good people from Toronto actually that I still do audio and video segments with. That stock is like a 60 to 90 cent stock, and it really ran. And I found out a few days later from watching CNBC or something, Dave Portnoy, who owns Barstool Sports, who's the Davey Day Trader segment they've been running. Yeah. Apparently that was one of his recommendations, and that's why it ran.
Oh, that's hilarious.
So really? it once again coming full circle. You're talking about an app which has a lot of potential, a company I've worked with for over a decade, and they got caught up in this whole sports trader turned day trader thing, and it was one of the reasons
I fully subscribe to the fact that the fastest bull market rally seen in history is purely due to the fact that the sports bettors have nothing else to do but to listen to Barstool Sports and bet. And the moment that sports go live,
exactly,
the market's just going to crash. I'm joking for anybody.
You heard it here, folks.
I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what. You say that with tongue in cheek, I hope, because I think there is a little something to some of the volatility. Yeah, it's hard to imagine a market as big as the financial markets could be moved, because I know how much smaller the sports markets are. So I didn't give it much credence until the last couple of weeks. So we'll see. Speaking about when sports resume, baseball now looks like they might be back in the mix as well. That's mid-July. Both NHL hockey and NBA pro basketball are the last week of July. So anybody out there who wants to track this theory, early August will be when what hits the fan, if there is any correlation. So we'll see what happens.